For this debate. It's been contentious. You've seen the attack ads. Your mailbox has been filled with the mailers. I'm sorry, this is the state treasurer's race. A slightly lower key, but no less important race you'll be deciding on your November ballot. We have the two contenders with us, the Republican Kimberly Yee and the Democrat Mark Manoil. Will be asking questions of them, and we'll start out with the opening statements of about a minute apiece. And Mr. Manoil, you won the dice game. You get to go first.
Thank you, Richard. I'm Mark Manoil. I'm a fourth-generation Arizonan with roots stretching back to territorial days. My ancestors saw endless potential in Arizona, and so do I. Today, I'm a small business owner. I manage a law practice, and a large part of what we do is property tax enforcement, particularly against speculators who would avoid those obligations. I'm running for treasurer because it used to be that you could buy a house, start a family, and actually get a decent job without incurring massive debt and without risking poverty. That's just not the case anymore, not for most of us. We need a treasurer who will fight for opportunity, and I'm well prepared to do that.
Thank you. And for her opening statement of, again, about a minute long, we turn to Kimberly Yee.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Kimberly Yee, and I was born and raised in Arizona. I'm a wife, mother, and small business owner. I'm running for state treasurer because I care about Arizona and its future. The treasurer's office is a place I know well because I used to work there, so I understand the operations of the office. My background, experience, and education have prepared me for this job. The Treasurer's Office manages nearly $15 billion in assets under management. For the past 22 years, I have helped shape and analyze public budgets. I've been a trusted advocate for the taxpayer and have pressed for more transparency. I've also worked across the aisle so that we can find better solutions together. And I have never wavered as a fiscal conservative. Voters deserve someone they can trust, someone who will uphold the office with honesty and integrity. I will continue to create programs to allow Arizona to prosper and always put the taxpayer first. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll go to questions for both of you, alternating who goes first. So we'll start, this question will go to you, Ms. Yee. There's a proposition on the ballot that would put something in the Constitution of the state of Arizona that would essentially make it nearly impossible to enact a sales tax on services. What are your thoughts on the question? Are you for it or against it?
It's an interesting proposition because I have advocates that I know on both sides of the aisle. It is a difficult one because once we put something in place like that, it does tie the hands of future lawmakers and policymakers if we are in a dire situation where we might need to consider all options. However, I am not for tax increases, so I understand the premise of this proposition, and the reason for it is because we've got to make sure that we don't have it easy to raise taxes. My opponent, on the other hand, wants to repeal Proposition 108, for instance, which Arizona voters in 1992 said, let's create taxpayer protections in the law so that it creates a 2/3 majority for the legislature to raise taxes or create fees on the people of Arizona. I believe we should keep it in place because I do not believe in tax increases.
And that was later in the question list, but again, how are you going to vote on that?
I will likely vote against the proposition.
Mr. Manoil, your thoughts on that proposition about banning sales taxes on sales?
Well, I do too. I agree that it's a bad public policy proposition because the nature of commerce is actually moving away from goods towards services. So to head it off at the pass and to prevent flexibility in revenue raising is just a bad idea. I would like to respond to the Prop 108 presentation of my position by my opponent because I think this is one of the prime examples of why Proposition 126 would be such a bad idea. Prop 108 has been a disaster for our state. It's resulted in a continuous ratcheting down of state income, and then that's been made worse by legislative majorities, including Ms. Yee as a leader there, in voting for tax cuts repeatedly. So that since 1992, since that law went into effect, we've had $4.4 billion cut out of our annual budget. And I submit that that's the reason we're seeing people, 75,000 educators marching on the Capitol, is because we are unable to fund our obligations properly.
Let me ask both of you follow-ups on that, but starting with you, since voters put this in, do you think they erred in putting it in, and what makes you think they would reverse if given the opportunity?
Well, I think the evidence is in now. At the time, there was exhaustion with tax hikes that had occurred in the 1980s. We were coming off the Prop 13 wildfire from California that was spreading across the country, trying to cap taxes, and everybody must have thought that, gee, we're done. We have reached the end of history, and government never needs to have new revenue. But since 1992, Arizona legislators primarily have cut out 5 sources of revenue that go into our general fund, including the state level property tax, including estate taxes, and we have now become overly dependent on sales taxes, which hit the lowest income earners in our state the hardest. So we have about a 50% revenue dependence on sales taxes instead of having a more diverse tax base.
And I guess for the Treasurer's office, it's not necessarily an office where you get to decide tax policy like you do in the state legislature. Does it make sense to take away one of the tools that the legislature would have in generating new revenue if the state needs it?
Well, let's be very clear, and my opponents made it very clear. Mark Manoil wants to raise Arizona taxes, and I do not. Out of the Treasurer's office, this is not a policy-making office. If Mark Manoil wants to raise taxes, he should run for the legislature or for the governor's office. It's very clear in our Constitution that the Arizona Treasurer maintains the investments of the office, and there are nearly $15 billion in assets under management. If you use this office as a platform for increasing taxes, that will not be good for Arizona. It will take away from the role constitutionally of the state treasurer, which is to manage the state tax dollars in a prudent and safe way.
Richard, I think I need an opportunity to respond to that. Just to make a blanket statement that I want to raise taxes ignores about 99% of my argument. My argument is that I would like to restore power to the state legislature as a branch of government so that it can do its job, which it has not been doing. We've had leaders like Ms. Yee who've made things worse by continuous tax cutting. Now, she likes to refer to that as being a taxpayer protector, but that language comes to us from the organization that wants to famously drown government in the bathtub. And that's not what Arizona needs. We have 50% less funding for our universities than we did 10 years ago. We have a legislature that has completely eliminated funding for community colleges in Maricopa County and Pima County, and these are traditional ladders of opportunity and growth in our state. So I think Ms. Yee needs to own her record as a legislator and recognize that that's all relevant to the decision making about who should be the state treasurer. Is it somebody who is cutting out opportunities or somebody who wants to fight for opportunities?
But again, the state treasurer doesn't enact the policy. They steward the finances of the state given what is there. What role does the treasurer have to play in advocating for or against tax increases?
As an independently elected executive, the treasurer is in a unique position to challenge bad budgets from our legislature. But going beyond that, we have examples from at least half a dozen other states where treasurers have taken the initiative on opportunity creating initiatives like children's savings accounts to help them prepare and get mentally prepared, and their families around them get mentally prepared for going to college. We know that economic development is going to depend on an educated workforce, and that is one of the key tools for economic development in our state. And yet those tools have been taken away from us over the last 20 years.
Is there a role for the treasurer to use the office to speak and advise the legislature on what they should do when it comes to taxes?
There certainly is a role for the platform to be available. I think that the Treasurer's Office can do a better job in forecasting and allowing policymakers to understand how much money is coming in and how much money is going out. It is like the state's bank. In fact, when I used to work in the State Treasurer's Office under Treasurer Dean Martin between 2006 to 2010, we saw that there were monies going out at a high rate when the monies were just not coming in at the same level. And so we warned the legislature, we warned Governor Napolitano at that time that they needed to stop spending at that same rate. They didn't listen to us, and look what happened. In 2008, 9, and 10, we were really in a big problem financially. However, the State Treasurer's Office at that time planned and prepared for that fiscal downturn, and we were making money out of the State Treasurer's Office because we planned well for the investments of the office when the rest of the country was dealing with the fiscal downturn of that deficit.
Well, let's discuss some...
May I add one thing to that, though? 2009, when you were there, was the time when the state's credit rating was lowered by bankrate.com, in large part because of the inability of our state to create new revenue. And that ties us back to Prop 108. So I think you gave half the story, and we needed to have the other half.
If we want to go back to Proposition 108, again, my opponent is very simple. He wants to repeal 108. He wants to raise Arizona taxes in an easier way. But the voters of Arizona unanimously, they went forward to put this on the ballot to be able to say we want it to be harder for the legislature and the governor to increase our fees, to increase taxes. It was a taxpayer protection measure that the people of Arizona passed on a majority of the voters in 1992, and he wants to repeal that.
And to you, does it still make fiscal sense to have that in place?
Absolutely, and we have used that proposition over the course of time to be able to protect the taxpayers' dollars. These are hard-earned taxpayer dollars, so we need to make sure that we have more than just a simple majority when we pass any increases in taxes through the legislature and the governor.
Should that also apply to tax cuts too, though?
And tax cuts have been brought forward to the legislature by our manufacturing industries as well as many of our chambers of commerce. I have been endorsed by the Arizona Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the Phoenix Chamber of Commerce, and they believe, like I do, that we as business owners, you're a business owner as well.
That it should be easier to cut taxes than to raise them.
Thank you.
That's your point.
Thank you. So what I would like to continue to pursue is that we have businesses that are able to pursue their economic interests through a free marketplace, through competitive, a marketplace that we have in place, and we have allowed for them to be able to come to Arizona to build jobs, to create job growth, and this revitalizes our economy, and it has done very well for Arizona. That's why we're on the map. That's why we've taken jobs away from California.
Well, let's talk about corporate sales tax exemptions. Mr. Manoil, you've discussed ending some of those exemptions. Are there specific ones you have in mind?
Well,
again, knowing it's not a policy-making position, but you must have some thoughts.
I'm not trying to superimpose myself as an uber legislator, but I think it has been demonstrated now that having just a one-way street on this issue, having it be a very simple matter to pander based on tax cutting in election years, and then face the terrible realities of not having enough funds available and not having the political will or even the political ability to reverse bad tax cuts. For instance, the corporate income tax that was phased in over 5 years that was $500 million or more out of our annual budget. Yes, I'm sure the folks who had their taxes cut were really happy about that, but that was $500 million out of our operating budget, which presumably made a difference in our ability to fund education.
And as you mentioned, talking points, I mean, Democrats have, since the Napolitano years, have talked about going in and closing loopholes.
Yes.
Why hasn't it happened? Are they just not there? Is it?
That's considered raising revenue under our system. That requires the 2/3 supermajority vote under Prop 108. That's my point. Is it's easy to do the tax spending, to give away the money and drain the general fund, but it's very hard to get it back once you've done that.
Ms. Yee, you talked about creating a task force to recommend reforms to the state sales tax system. Obviously, that could be a dodge. The task force will figure it out, but what do you expect them to find when they look at the state sales tax system?
Well, I always think that it's important to have everyone around the table to always take a look at how we can update and improve upon our state laws. And I think by my research, we haven't had a sales tax task force since the days of Jane D. Hull. And I think it's about time that we take a look at what we have in place. I'm sure the task force will be able to look at what other states have done well. And if we can use some improvements in our tax system, we would have this independent task force to be able to provide recommendations to the legislature and to the governor to be able to update and improve upon what we have in place now.
But you're talking about simplifying, not necessarily closing loopholes.
I think it's very important that they look at the overall picture of what our state tax system looks like. I think it's very important to look at how we even file taxes. For the person who's a small business owner, how can we make it easier for them to be able to understand the tax system and be able to file easier? And we also need to make sure that we don't have people going off and doing things around the system so that we can capture those funds that might be being exploited by those who are trying to use the system.
And do you agree with the notion that closing a loophole would have to take a supermajority of the legislature?
It's important that we continue to use Proposition 108 as it was intended.
I think that was a yes.
Yes. The governor this morning on an editorial board meeting said he was open to changes in the way tax credits are given to student tuition organizations, a program that's been in place in Arizona for a while. Ms. Yee, what do you think of that program, and is that dollar for dollar tax credit being used properly in Arizona?
The tax...
This is you can designate money,
yes.
a dollar for dollar tax credit, to be used for student tuition organizations that pay tuitions for not your child, but children in private schools.
My understanding is it's an optional program. So citizens in Arizona who want to help out students who can't afford, for instance, to pay for their private education can use this program optionally. It certainly isn't forced upon any taxpayer, but it does allow for some of those families in high poverty areas who want to go to that school of their choice that is private to be able to afford that program through this optional program that allows for the general public to help alongside a family that can't afford a private school education. And I think that all families should be able to have that choice. If that's the best education and the best school for that child, they certainly should have those options.
Okay, and Mr. Manoil, the governor again said he was looking at possible reforms to it. Do you think it's being used properly as it's in place now?
I think it has been a valuable opportunity for people, but now combined with the vouchers that we are going to be voting on Proposition 305, you just have a sieve essentially in the general fund. And what we have seen most consistently is self-enrichment by legislators who are participating in programs like the STO program, or more famously, Mr. Farnsworth with his selling back his charter school to the state and reaping an enormous profit from that exercise.
Right, slightly a different issue, but yeah, you're talking about now the two.
I am trying to get at the responsibility of our state legislators who seem to think that making private education a higher priority than public education is bad public policy.
Thoughts on, he just slammed all the legislators. I don't know if you took that as a personal slam.
Well, anyone who knows my work at the state legislature knows that I am an advocate for public education. I am the product of Arizona public schools. My mother taught in the public elementary school system here in Arizona for 38 years. And I have gone into our classrooms. I have spoken with the teachers. I support more funding for our teachers. It's not acceptable for teachers to have to buy their supplies at the local garage sale down the street. And so in my work at the legislature, I've always fought. You might not see it in the front pages, but I've always fought for public education and more dollars for our classrooms.
One we did see on the front pages was Proposition 123, former treasurer, then governor, that became governor, Doug Ducey, to get out of an education funding lawsuit, proposed Proposition 123. We'll start with Mr. Mr. Manoil. He altered the payout of the state land trust, which the treasurer's office takes care of. Was that the right move? Would you have done the same?
No, I would have opposed it, and I think Ms. Yee eventually will come clean and indicate that she would have opposed it too. The real point, though, was that the inaction of the legislature was being made up for in that settlement by looting future students' opportunities by drawing principal out of the trust, invading the principle of that trust. And that is horrible public policy. It's a betrayal of future students. And it's also a whitewash over this legislature that doesn't want to see teachers paying for supplies, and yet is consistently voting for budgets that cut our revenues that would help pay for those supplies.
And Ms. Yee, you were in the legislature. You expressed concerns when Prop 123 was proposed.
I did.
What are your thoughts on its overall enactment?
Well, before it was called Prop 123, remember I worked in the State Treasurer's Office under Dean Martin back in 2007, 8, and 9, and around that time, Janet Napolitano's administration actually proposed a very similar idea, and even back then, we rejected it from the State Treasurer's Office. So it wasn't news to me that Jeff DeWitt was going to also, alongside with numerous state treasurers in the past, oppose that. And so I had deep concerns when the proposal was brought to me, even though many in my caucus really liked the idea because they did want to settle this suit. I believe that we should fund education out of our general fund because we can watch and see those dollars coming in, and we can have accountability over those dollars. When we take a look at this type of fiscal policy to break open the principle of a trust that should be there for generations in our future, it really is settling an issue for the time being. And what's going to happen in 10 years is there's going to be a cliff. And unfortunately, it's going to be very difficult to stop that gravy train from going forward. And so when it comes time to decide what to do, my guess is people are going to want to continue on with that proposal. And I don't agree that we should be using our state land trust to break open because the interest decreases alongside that proposal.
So you would look at not continuing it in the future?
Right. There are ways that we can do that by putting on the ballot, for instance, just sort of a stop a date for when that proposal ends. Right now it's only supposed to be for 10 years, so it shouldn't go forward without any further legislation. However, you remember, the people of Arizona were told that Prop 123 was going to fund our teachers' pay, and it didn't. In many school districts that called my office and said that the commercial said that the school districts were going to promise us teacher pay, and the districts chose not to go that route, unfortunately. This is not an issue that should be settled on, the state land trust endowment. That should be for future generations. So it should be the legislature's, responsibility to pay for these educational funds, important for Arizona teachers, out of the general fund.
Would you like to see it go the decade and no more, or would you want to see it this idea cut off?
I think, frankly, as stewards of that trust, we have an obligation to see how we can restore it from this violation. I'm very pleased to hear what you just said about the legislature's responsibility. I just wish you had taken more of that responsibility as you have served there, because this invasion is going to impact students. There's just no question about it. We still have a lot of land to sell, but that doesn't mean it's not finite. So we have an obligation to those students in the future. We have an obligation to the students now. Unfortunately, some students have been shortchanged that we can't do anything about, but we need to have a responsible legislature. We need to have a state treasurer who's actually going to call out the legislature when they're not meeting their obligations and at least make a public issue of it rather than being somebody who goes along to get along.
During, when Arizona faced this severe recession, another plan that the legislature enacted was selling buildings and leasing them back. And I guess that, coupled with the previous question, are there lessons we learned in the last downturn that you would apply if the state faces a future economic crisis, Ms. Yee?
Well, first, I believe that the Treasurer's Office can play a more critical role to forecast future budgets so that we aren't in a situation like we were in back in that day. And we could be able to see years out, where the revenues are going to be so that we can plan accordingly in future budgets. What we did back in selling, selling and leasing the state buildings, that was really embarrassing. And Arizona was in the news all over the country for it. At that time, it was a way to maintain the state's credit rating, for instance. And so in that regard, that was one of the reasons why they put it on the table. Another alternative could have been to raise taxes. Obviously, I would have been opposed to that. I was not in the legislature at that time, and it was, again, during that time when I believe the Treasurer's Office was doing the best it could when you had a Democrat governor and a Republican legislature that weren't getting along on fiscal policy. The best that we could do back then, and I think how we can move forward, is to continue to provide really good fiscal forecasts past in out-budget years, not only to policymakers around the state capitol, but also so that our local governments can also use that type of information in their planning.
But quick follow-up, you mentioned it being slightly embarrassing that we sold buildings and leased them back, sold the capital and leased it back, but you said you wouldn't have raised taxes. Taxes was still not a viable option to you, as opposed to selling and leasing back?
I think there's so many ways that we can reduce and reduce the size and scope of government. I have spent my career looking, even before I was elected, I was looking at how wasteful government spending is in so many different areas. We have boards and commissions that are misusing and abusing taxpayer dollars. When I worked in California for one of the governors out there, I found warehouses full of unused surplus property. These were agencies that were spending every single penny they could at the end of the fiscal year, because if they didn't use it, they would lose it. And so warehouses full, half a mile long, were being spent with crates and crates of unused surplus property, desks and chairs still with the plastic around them. And all they could do is, that was for me a clear view of wasteful government spending.
Mr. Manoil, a lot to unpack, but we'll stay with the original question, which was, are there lessons to be learned from the last economic downturn going forward? And I guess a side thing, bringing up what she mentioned, is there enough waste in government that can be cut to help the state's economic picture?
We're at the point now where for Governor Ducey to make good on his 20 by 2020 plan at the legislature with no new revenue this year, other funds had to be drained, and monies had to be shifted because there was no new revenue. So there's only one type of equation that this leadership seems to understand, and that is cutting alleging waste while a lot of people are suffering in our state. Now, do you mind going back to your original question about lessons learned? I think the lesson learned is that our state is over-dependent on sales tax because we have narrowed the sources of revenue that our state collects and pays our government with. So if 50% of our revenues are sales tax revenues, and believe it or not, we might have an economic downturn. That seems to happen from time to time in Arizona. Arizona history, and it certainly did, and that's one of the lessons we should have learned, is that we should have a broader, more diverse tax base so that we're more resilient when that sort of thing happens, rather than having all our eggs in one basket, having those revenues crater, and then using it as an excuse for further cuts to education, further cuts to critical services, because that is what we have been seeing. That's the lesson we learn from looking just at the last 20 years and our economic cycles.
You jumped to my next question, so I'll instead ask you a follow-up. Would you enact other taxes besides a sales tax, property tax, and income tax raising? What would you see to raise revenue besides sales tax?
Well, again, let me be clear that I am not suggesting myself as a legislator, but I think that to have a strong credit rating in our state, we need to have a diverse tax base instead of a shrinking tax base. And Republicans like Ms. Yee have thought that shifting more burden into the sales tax arena was just fine. It's just that it results in the lowest 20% of income earners in our state bearing more than twice of their income burden than the highest 1% in our state. I favor a broader mix of revenue sources like we had before 5 of them were essentially eliminated from the general fund during the 1990s, including a state-level property tax, which at that time was worth about $150 million in our budget. We had an estate tax. There was a mix of different types of taxes so that no one thing could hurt us. And right now, we are vulnerable.
And Ms. Yee, speaking again, you're not seeking office as a legislature, but as a steward of the state's finances. What is your thoughts on the state's revenue mix? Are we too dependent on sales taxes?
Well, I don't believe in raising our taxes. And as you can read between the lines, my opponent does by creating that new mix or going back to the mix that we used to do. That's creating more taxes for hardworking Arizonans. I don't agree with that. And it's very important that we continue to talk about increasing our economic growth by bringing more jobs to the state so that we can have more economic activity. More people who don't have this increased sales tax idea will contribute to our economy. They'll buy more, they'll have jobs so that they can afford to buy more, and then that increases and generates more revenue so that our general fund can be more robust so that we can spend on critical services like education, healthcare, and corrections. These are all very important services, but we can't have that without an economic development plan and someone who will be able to keep our taxes low.
And you talk about the state continuing to grow. What do you think the state's forecast would be during, if you are elected, your 4-year term? Does your optimism or pessimism affect your fiscal policy?
Absolutely, and I do think that things are on the upturn. We have seen great positive economic trends. In fact, the state revenues grew by over 13%, and this is much more than forecasted. We had our sales tax rose 8.6%, depositing more than $17 million than was forecast. We have some positive outlooks ahead of us, and with that, we can certainly grow our economy. We can continue to bring more jobs to Arizona, and that will create the activity that we need to generate the revenue so that we can spend on these critical services like education, healthcare, and in making sure that our neighborhoods are safe.
Will the happy days continue, Mr. Manoil?
I heard an interesting story recently, and that was that the relocation decisions for companies looking at places in Arizona to bring their pre-existing businesses, which is often the focus of our economic development efforts, as opposed to developing tools for entrepreneurs inside our state. Those decisions, in large part, are being made by the HR personnel, the personnel directors of companies. It's not some other aspect about availability of widgets or other resources. Is this going to be a place where we can retain the employees we bring here or hire here? Will they like living here? And if this community doesn't value resources that value human capital, namely education and investing in opportunity for individuals, then they're not going to make those decisions. I think this is a magic elixir that has been sold to us for too long about eliminate taxes and everybody will come here for the free ride. It doesn't work that way, and sales taxes is not going to fund the needs that we have in our state. I think I've stated my position about the need for a diverse tax base. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to ignore Prop 108. It means that even if it's just revenue neutral redistribution of the tax liability, we can create more resilience in our state and have a safer future.
Thank you both. We will allow our candidates to take a little breath. We'll come back with their closing statements after you watch this. We'll see you in about a minute.
I'm a reporter and columnist for azcentral.com and the Arizona Republic. I'm also the mother of a teenager, a book lover, a 2-time ASU graduate, a theater set painter, a tap dancer, and someone who has called Arizona home for nearly 4 decades. I've worked for newspapers for more than 30 years. Sometimes I write about my own victories and stumbles. Other times, I write about the lives of people you might never have met. Because I've learned that words have the power to change things for the better. I write to move you, to reflect, to care, to understand, to take action. I write so you will see what makes us more alike than different.
life is complicated, but AZ Central is here to help find answers, to help solve problems, to make your life better. We're here to help.
Welcome back. We go now to our closing statements, and because Mr. Manoil started us off, closing statements, first one will be Ms. Kimberly Yee.
Thank you. I believe Arizona's
Hi, I'm
economy
Richard Relish,
thrives
reporter
when
at
we
the
keep our
Arizona
taxes
Republic.
low.
We're here in the
My
Republic
opponent
and
wants
AZ
to
Central
raise your
newsroom.
taxes. I believe we need to elect someone we can trust. My opponent admits on his campaign website that he has had his home foreclosed and his car repossessed because he can't even manage his own personal finances. In my day job, I help people. My opponent has taken down his business website because he doesn't want Arizona voters to know that he earns his living by stealing people's homes when they fall upon hard times. The 2017 Arizona Republic article, which can be found on my website, names Mark Manoil one of the top 4 predatory lawyers who snatch away homes from vulnerable families from high poverty neighborhoods. The article calls this vicious and draconian. I'm running for state treasurer because I care about all Arizona families. I've been endorsed by 5 former state treasurers because they trust that I will manage your money, putting the taxpayer first. Thank you.
And thank you, Ms. Yee. With his closing statement, Mark Manoil.
Thank you. I'll look forward to our next opportunity to get together and respond to your attack. I don't want to use my closing statement for that. I do invite you to visit my website and also look at the records of the Phoenix City Council, where I co-chaired a committee to remediate blight in our city, and it was a successful committee. All of its recommendations were unanimously adopted. For too long, our political establishment has enabled the bad behavior of corporations that gamble with our money and leave us behind to pick up the pieces. When the government stops working for the people, which I submit in large part it has with Ms. Yee's leadership, we must elect new leaders to fix it. I will fight to turn back the tide of inequality in our state, to create opportunity, and to restore integrity to an office that has let politicians get away with bad budgets and self-dealing. I'm Mark Manoil, and I ask for your vote.
And thank you for joining us. We said those were the closing statements, and although I'm itching to ask follow-up questions, we follow the rules. Ryan Randazzo will be writing the story on this debate, and he might be following up on some of the stuff that was said that isn't addressed right now. Thank you for joining us. Stay with AZ Central for this race and all the other election races coming up. The voter guide is there and all of our political coverage. For now, have a good night, stay dry, and thank you.